He was shot in the head, and he kept fighting. They shattered his arm, tore open his chest, left him bleeding in the sand under a desert sun that didn't care if he lived or died. And he kept fighting. Most men would have stopped. Most men would have taken the evacuation, the honorable discharge, the ticket home. Charles Upham wasn't most men. He was a New Zealand officer who did something no other combat soldier in history has ever done. He earned the Victoria Cross twice, the highest military honor in the British Empire, once for refusing to die in Crete, once for refusing to surrender in North Africa. But this isn't a story about medals. It's about a man who carried wounded soldiers through machine gun fire while his own blood poured into the dirt. A man who destroyed enemy positions alone because no one else would. A man who broke every rule, ignored every order, and sacrificed every part of himself to save the men who followed him. This is the story the military didn't want you to hear, the story of what it actually costs to be called a hero, and why Charles Upham spent the rest of his life trying to forget it. No cover, no mercy. May 1941. Crete was supposed to be a temporary stand, a place to slow the enemy and buy time. That was the theory written on maps far from the island. In reality, Crete was exposed, underprepared, and waiting for something no one had fully imagined. Charles Upham stood near the trench line overlooking Malem airfield as the morning settled into an unnatural calm. The silence pressed against the ears, the kind that experienced soldiers learned to distrust, not peace. Anticipation. Behind him were his men, young New Zealanders, many barely out of their teens, farm boys and students holding rifles that felt heavier than they should. Some tried to joke. Most did not. They all felt it coming. Then the sky changed. At first it was just movement, shadows sliding across the light. Then more. Then hundreds. German paratroopers poured from the aircraft, white canopies opening across the horizon, blotting out the sun like a spreading infection. War was no longer advancing from the front. It was falling from above. Someone shouted contact, and the moment shattered. Machine guns erupted from every direction at once. Mortars followed, tearing the ground apart without warning. Some Germans were killed before they reached the earth. Others landed, rolled, and came up firing. The noise became constant, a wall of sound that erased individual voices and swallowed commands whole. Charles moved immediately. He shouted orders, spreading his men, forcing sectors of fire where none had been planned. Find cover. Watch your angles. Stay low, but there was no cover. The ground around Malem was flat and exposed, shallow trenches carved into earth that offered little protection against an enemy descending from the sky. Charles ran between positions, directing fire, repositioning men, trying to impose order on chaos. His throat burned from shouting. His pulse hammered. His hands were steady. Then the impact came. A violent force struck the side of his head, heat and pressure exploding into white light. The bullet tore through his ear, not killing him, but close enough to shut the world off. Charles dropped to one knee, his hand flying instinctively to his head. When he pulled it away, his palm was slick with blood. It ran down his neck, soaked into his collar, dripped into the dirt. Sound disappeared, replaced by a high ringing that drowned everything else. This was the moment the body stopped negotiating. For a fraction of a second, instinct told him to stay down, to wait for a medic, to let someone else take command. Then another instinct pushed harder. Get up. Not heroism. Necessity. If he stayed down, men would die. Charles forced himself to stand. His balance wavered. His vision swam. He picked up his rifle and kept moving. That was when he heard the scream. Private Jenkins, 20 years old, a farm kid from Canterbury. Jenkins lay in the open 15 meters from the trench, his leg twisted into an angle legs were never meant to take. Bone visible through torn flesh. Blood pooled beneath him as he tried to crawl, every movement ending in another scream. Charles watched German soldiers adjust their aim. No one else moved. Not from fear, but from understanding. The ground between the trench and Jenkins was a kill zone. Anyone who crossed it would be shot. It was simple, mathematical. Charles went anyway. There was no speech, no calculation. He ran. The world narrowed to breath and movement. boots striking earth, bullets snapping past his head, close enough to tear the air. Dirt kicked up around his feet. Something hot ripped through fabric on his shoulder without breaking skin. He reached Jenkins and dragged him up by the arms. Jenkins screamed, a raw animal sound stripped of language. Charles told him he had him, even if the words were lost in the noise. Dragging a wounded man through open ground under fire is not heroic. It is slow, heavy, exhausting. Charles's muscles burned. His wounded ear throbbed with every heartbeat. Blood from both men mixed together, turning everything slick and hard to grip. A mortar exploded close enough to knock Charles sideways. He stumbled, but did not let go. 5 meters, then 2. Hands reached out from the trench and pulled them both down. Charles collapsed on top of Jenkins, gasping, his body shaking uncontrollably. Not this time. Medics rushed Jenkins. Someone tried to examine Charles, but he pushed them away and told his men to get back to their positions. The Germans were still coming, and they did. The fighting did not slow. It expanded. For 3 days, the battle consumed the area around Malem. 3 days without sleep. 3 days without real food. 3 days without silence. Charles refused evacuation when medics tried to pull him back. Infection spread in his ear. Pain settled into his body and stayed there. He ignored it. Every time the thought of stopping appeared, it was replaced by another task, another position to clear, another man who needed help. From here on, survival was no longer logical. He led counterattacks against German positions, moving forward when retreat made more sense on paper. He destroyed machine gun nests with grenades. He carried more wounded soldiers to safety. He ignored orders to pull back when pulling back meant leaving men behind. His authority did not come from rank, it came from presence. His men followed because he stayed. This was different. By the time evacuation finally came, Charles Upham barely resembled the man who had landed on Crete. His uniform was stiff with dried blood. His face was hollow, eyes sunken, movements reduced to what was necessary. He boarded the evacuation boat and turned to look back at the island. Smoke rose from scattered fires. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Crete had taken everything it could. Charles sat down on the deck and closed his eyes. For the first time in 72 hours, he allowed himself to stop. He did not know officers had been watching him, recording actions, writing reports. He did not know that his refusal to quit was already being documented. All he knew was that he had survived, and that the war was not finished with him yet. Flesh torn, orders ignored. July 1942, North Africa. El Ruvisat Ridge was not a battlefield in the romantic sense of the word. It was an exposed spine of desert where heat punished the body even before the enemy fired a shot. The air burned the lungs. The ground reflected the sun back into the eyes. There was nowhere to hide and nothing to absorb mistakes. Charles Upham stood at the edge of the New Zealand positions and looked across the ridge with the quiet understanding that this place would demand more than Crete ever had. He had been back in combat for 2 months. 2 months since a medal ceremony he barely remembered. 2 months since words like courage and honor had been spoken over him, while the images from Crete continued to surface in his sleep. The Victoria Cross had not stopped the ringing in his damaged ear. It had not repaired his body. It had not given him rest. The plan was simple in the way plans always are when written far from consequences. Advance at night. Take the ridge. Hold it. Intelligence reported light resistance. Intelligence promised manageable casualties. Intelligence failed the moment the first flare went up. As the New Zealanders moved forward through darkness, the ridge revealed itself as a trap. Machine guns opened with perfect overlap, stitching the ground with fire. Mortars followed, timed and accurate. Men fell before they could understand what was happening. The desert swallowed sound and returned it as chaos. This was different. Charles moved instinctively, trying to regain control, shouting orders that were half lost in the noise. He led from the front because hesitation in open ground meant death. Then the bullet hit his left arm. There was no warning, no time to brace. The impact shattered bone and tore through muscle and nerve in a single violent moment. Pain erased thought. Charles screamed and dropped to his knees, clutching the ruined arm against his chest as blood poured freely between his fingers. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to sensation alone. Heat, pressure, fire. There was no recovery. Then other sounds forced their way back in. Men screaming for medics. Corporal Matthews gasping as blood filled his chest. Private O'Connor clutching his stomach, begging for help that could not reach him in time. Lieutenant Fraser shouting orders that no longer aligned with the reality around them. The ridge was killing them. Charles forced himself upright. His left arm hung uselessly, bone grinding with movement, but his right arm still worked. That was enough. He began giving orders again, reorganizing what remained of the line, forcing structure onto collapse. His men stared at him, stunned. Their captain was standing in the open with a destroyed arm and blood soaking his uniform, still commanding. From here on, survival was no longer logical. Then the mortars closed in. The first explosion landed close enough to knock men flat. The second tore open the ground behind them. The third landed less than 10 feet from Charles. Shrapnel ripped into his chest and shoulder, cracking ribs and tearing flesh. The blast lifted him and slammed him into the sand. He could not breathe. Blood filled his mouth. Darkness crept inward. This was the point where the body usually stopped. Not this time. Charles pushed himself up through sheer refusal. First his hands, then his knees, then somehow his feet. Blood ran down his chest in sheets. His shattered arm swung uselessly at his side. He should not have been conscious. He should not have been standing. He grabbed a rifle from a fallen soldier and braced it against his hip, firing one-handed into advancing German positions. The recoil nearly knocked him over. He stayed upright. His men saw him. They saw what the body was supposed to do and what it was doing instead. Something shifted. The line stabilized. Men who had been seconds from breaking found enough resolve to hold. It did not last. German tanks arrived, followed by artillery that crushed any remaining illusion of control. The counterattack overwhelmed the ridge. Charles ordered a retreat, knowing it was the only option left. When his men began to fall back, his legs finally failed him. He collapsed into the sand, unable to move. Matthews and O'Connor, both wounded, dragged him back under fire, ignoring his attempts to tell them to leave him. The field hospital was chaos. Bodies laid out faster than doctors could work. When they saw Charles, everything paused for a moment. The question escaped before anyone could stop it. How was he still alive? Charles drifted in and out of consciousness. He heard fragments of conversation, severe trauma, massive blood loss. The word Victoria Cross surfaced again, quietly this time, spoken with disbelief. It made no sense to him. The objective had failed. Men were dead. This felt like defeat, not valor. But those who had seen him fight understood something that rarely appears in official language. This was not glory. It was refusal. Refusal to stop when stopping meant abandoning the men who trusted him. Weeks later, still unfit for combat, Charles was informed that he would receive a second Victoria Cross, something no combat infantry officer in history had ever achieved. He did not celebrate. He did not understand it. All that remained with him was the same question that had formed in the desert as darkness closed in. Why had his body held when so many others had not? Section 3. El Alamein. Every step a defiance. October 1942. El Alamein was meant to decide the war in North Africa. For Charles Upham, it should have been a place he never returned to. Weeks earlier, doctors had told him his body needed time, not another battlefield. His left arm was still damaged, strength unreliable, movement limited. His chest wounds had healed poorly, leaving pain that sharpened with every breath. The ringing in his ear never stopped. On paper, he was unfit for combat. In reality, he walked back to his unit anyway. Weeks later, still unfit for combat, he rejoined the men who had followed him through Crete and El Ruwaysat, because leaving them felt worse than the pain. The night before the offensive, Charles sat alone in his tent, trying to force his left hand to cooperate. The fingers moved slowly, without precision. No grip, no confidence. The arm that had once dragged wounded men through fire now felt like something detached from him. His right arm still worked. That would have to be enough. Outside, the desert was silent in a way that never meant safety. At 9:40 p.m. on October 23rd, the silence ended. More than 1,000 Allied guns fired at once, unleashing the largest artillery barrage the desert had ever felt. The horizon burned white. The ground shook so violently that men grabbed one another to stay upright. Charles stood at the front of his company and watched the shells arc overhead, knowing each explosion meant destruction somewhere ahead. At 10 p.m., the order came to advance. Charles stepped forward. His men followed. Again, the bombardment had damaged German positions, but it had not erased them. As the New Zealanders moved into the minefields, machine guns opened from concealed trenches. Mortars followed. Artillery began to fall. The desert became a maze of explosions and shouted commands that collided and disappeared. The first mine detonated and killed 3 men instantly. The second took 2 more. Charles shouted for his men to keep moving. Stopping meant death. There was no alternative. They reached the first German trench line and were pinned down by overlapping fire. 50 meters of open ground separated them from the machine guns. No cover, no protection. Lieutenant Fraser looked at the position, then at Charles, already understanding what it meant. No one could cross that ground and live. This was the moment the bodies stopped negotiating. Charles did not argue. He told Fraser to cover him and moved before anyone could stop him. He ran low and fast, bullets cracking past his head, one tearing through his sleeve, another kicking sand inches from his boot. His chest burned. His left arm dragged uselessly. At 20 meters, the machine gun swung toward him. Charles saw the gunner's face, young and tense, eyes locked on a target that should not have been there. At 10 meters, Charles threw the grenade. The explosion silenced the gun. Before the smoke cleared, he was in the trench, firing one-handed at close range. His men surged forward and overwhelmed the position. There were more machine gun nests ahead. Charles did not stop. He moved from position to position, advancing through fire, destroying each with grenades and controlled rifle shots. His company followed, not because fear was gone, but because they had seen fear overridden. This was different. Then Charles saw the tanks. 3 German panzers advancing toward the New Zealand lines. If they reached the infantry, the battle would collapse. There were no anti-tank weapons close enough, no immediate support. Charles ran toward them anyway. The first tank loomed, metal grinding forward, diesel fumes heavy in the air. The machine gun opened fire. Charles dove flat, bullets ripping through the space where he had been standing. He pulled a grenade and threw it at the track. The explosion shattered the mechanism and stopped the tank cold. The second tank reacted, turret swinging wide. Charles moved through a shell crater, came at it from the side, and threw another grenade. The track blew apart. The third tank tried to adjust. Too late. Charles stood fully exposed and threw his last grenade. The blast damaged the engine, smoke pouring from the rear. 3 tanks disabled by a wounded infantry officer with grenades. War does not reward logic. Then the mortars returned. Precise, relentless. Artillery was called down on the position with no hesitation. Shrapnel tore into Charles's back, legs and shoulders. The force of the blast threw him forward into the sand. This time his body did what it had been threatening to do for weeks. It stopped. Charles could not get up. His men dragged him back under fire as explosions continued to fall. He tried to speak, to give orders, but blood filled his lungs and every breath burned. Not this time. The last thing Charles saw before consciousness left him was the sky. Empty and indifferent. The last thought that formed was an apology to the men who had died, to the ones who would keep fighting without him. By then, the war had moved on without him, even as his actions were being recorded and passed upward. Charles Upham had already done more than any man should have been asked to do. For the second time, the British Empire would recognize it with a Victoria Cross, an honor that would never be repeated. Charles did not know that yet. All that remained with him was darkness, pain, and a question that would never fully leave him. Why had he survived? July 1942 to May 1945. By the time Charles Upham became a prisoner of war, the timeline of his injuries had already blurred into something difficult to separate. Too many battles, too many wounds, too much blood. The truth was simpler than the records suggested. He was captured while still recovering from injuries that should have killed him at El Ruvesat. When German soldiers found him, they stood over his body in disbelief. The ground around him was dark with blood. His uniform was torn apart. His arm barely functioned. By any reasonable measure, he should have been dead. He was not. Charles was conscious enough to refuse questions. He met the eyes of the officers interrogating him without lowering his gaze. His body was broken, but his posture made one thing clear. Capturing him had not ended anything. The Germans did not quite know what to do with a man like that. They sent him to a prisoner of war camp in Italy, a place meant for officers who accepted that their war was finished. Men who waited, men who adapted, men who survived by compliance. Charles did not accept it. From the first day, he observed guard routines, fence placement, timing, weaknesses. The camp was surrounded by wire and towers, but security was relaxed. The Italians did not expect resistance. Most prisoners were relieved to be alive and grateful to be out of combat. Charles felt none of that relief. Waiting felt too close to surrender. 3 weeks after arrival, he made his first escape attempt. With 2 other New Zealand officers, he cut through the wire under cover of darkness and ran for the hills. For 4 days, they moved only at night, hiding during daylight, stealing food when they could. Charles's arm barely worked. His chest burned with every breath. Pain slowed him, but it did not stop him. They were caught at a roadblock and returned to the camp. The guards placed Charles in solitary confinement for 2 weeks, assuming the lesson had been learned. It had not. 2 months later, he escaped again, this time alone. He lasted 6 days before being recaptured. Solitary confinement followed, longer and harsher. Then he tried again and again. The Italian guards began to speak about him with a mixture of frustration and respect. They shook their heads when they brought him back, muttering about the New Zealander who refused to stay down. This was not bravery, it was refusal. When the Allies invaded Italy, the situation changed. The Germans took control of the camps and began transferring prisoners they considered dangerous or disruptive. Charles Upham's name appeared quickly. He was shackled and placed on a train bound for Germany under heavy guard. Charles jumped from the moving train anyway. He hit the ground hard, rolled, and ran despite the shackles cutting into his ankles. He made it 3 days before being caught. This time, the Germans beat him, not violently, but deliberately, enough to make the message clear. Charles did not cry out. He stared at them until they were finished. That was when the Germans decided he could not be held in ordinary camps. They sent him to Colditz Castle. Colditz was where Germany sent prisoners who would not comply. A fortress built into stone, perched on a cliff, surrounded by sheer drops and thick walls. Guard towers watched every angle. Searchlights swept the grounds at night. It was designed to be escape-proof. Other prisoners adapted in different ways. They staged plays, played cards, waited for the war to end. Charles studied the castle instead. Guard rotations, distances, patterns, possibilities. He attempted escape twice from Colditz. Both failed before he reached the outer perimeter. After the second attempt, the commandant summoned him. The German officer asked why he continued to risk his life when the war would eventually end and he would go home. Charles answered without hesitation, "Because I am still a soldier." The commandant studied him for a long moment. Then he ordered that Charles be placed under constant surveillance. For his own safety, he said. From that point on, escape was no longer possible. Charles spent the rest of the war isolated, watched, restricted. His body deteriorated in the cold. Old wounds stiffened. Pain became constant. Without action, without movement, the memories came more easily. Crete, El Ruvesat, El Alamein, faces of men who had not survived. The question returned every night. Why him? By then, the war had moved on without him. May 1945, American troops reached Colditz. The gates opened. Charles Upham walked out a free man. 3 years of captivity behind him. The Americans treated him like a legend. 2 Victoria Crosses. Stories they wanted to hear. Details they wanted preserved. Charles said little. He did not feel like a legend. He felt empty. The man who boarded the ship back to New Zealand was not the man who had landed on Crete 4 years earlier. That man was gone. What remained was quieter, harder, and permanently altered. His body carried the damage. His mind carried the weight. The war had ended. For Charles Upham, it had simply changed form. Charles Upham returned to New Zealand in late 1945. The war had ended, but the noise did not. Crowds gathered. Newspapers called him the greatest soldier the country had ever produced. 2 Victoria Crosses, a name fixed in history, a hero. Charles did not recognize himself in that word. He felt tired in a way that sleep could not touch. They offered parades, speeches, invitations to retell his story to a nation desperate for meaning after years of loss. Charles refused all of it. He bought a farm in a remote part of Canterbury, far from cameras and questions, a place where silence was possible and the land asked only for work. But war does not stop when the fighting ends. The nights followed him home. He woke drenched in sweat, hearing screams that no longer existed, seeing faces that never faded. Sometimes his wife found him standing in the dark, staring through the window, listening to something she could not hear. When she asked if he was all right, he said he was fine. It was easier than explaining. Always easier. His body never truly recovered. The left arm remained weak and unreliable. His chest hurt every day. The shrapnel wounds and broken ribs had healed wrong, turning each breath into a reminder. Pain became background noise, normal. But physical pain was not what weighed the most. That belonged to the question that never left him. Why did I survive? He avoided interviews. When historians came asking for details, he said he did not remember. It was not true. He remembered everything. Remembering was not the problem. Speaking was, because speaking turned memory into presence, and presence into weight. Charles Upham lived nearly 50 years after the war, 50 years of farming, family, and trying to build a quiet life from what remained. When he died in 1994, people gathered to honor the legend. Charles would not have wanted that. He never wanted to be extraordinary. He wanted to protect his men. He wanted them to live. This is the part they do not tell you. Heroes do not get happy endings. They get survival, and the weight of wondering why they deserved it when so many others did not. Charles Upham did impossible things. He saved lives that would have been lost. He earned honors that will never be matched, and he paid for them with pieces of himself that could never be recovered. This was the cost. This is what remained. What do you think kept Charles Upham moving when his body should have stopped? If this story mattered to you, stay with this channel.